During his long abode in the Cordilleras, Humboldt never found any structure resembling those which were termed Cyclopean. In every edifice that dated from the time of the Incas, the front of the stones were very skillfully cut, while the back part was rugged and often angular. Before Humboldt and Bonpland visited the ruins at Calo, Don Juan Lara had remarked that in the walls of the Incas' house, the interstices between the outer and inner stone were filled with small pebbles cemented with clay. Humboldt did not observe the circumstance. He saw no vestige of the floor or roof. He supposed, however, that the latter was of wood. He could not decide whether the edifice was originally more than a single story, or not, as the height of its walls had been diminished no less by the avidity of the neighboring peasantry, who took away the stones for their own use, than by the earthquakes, to which the unfortunate country was continually exposed. He thought it probable that this edifice, as well as the others which he heard called at Peru, Quito, and as far as the banks of the Amazon by the name of the Incas' houses, did not date further back than the 13th century. Sometime in August or September, Humboldt received intelligence that Wadden's expedition had sailed to the New Zealand, intending to pass homeward around the Cape of Good Hope. This frustrated his projected visit to the Philippine Islands, as he was by this time, however, somewhat accustomed to having his plans thwarted. He devised a new route, and as soon as it was practical, he and Bonpland started upon it. About the last of September, they left Quito, following the chain of Andes by the way of Asue, Hueca, and Loxa. The road which led them over the Parmo of Asue was nearly as high as Mont Blanc. Here it descended a valley, there it descended across a mountain, and a little further on it stretched mountainously across a level plain. In one of these plains, which was 6 leagues square in breadth, the travelers found lakes of fresh water of considerable depth. These lakes were bordered by a thick turf of alpine grasses, but contained no fish, and scarcely any aquatic insects. Here they found the remains of the great road of the Incas, which ran by the side of the heavily laden mules for over a mile. It had a deep under structure and was paved with well-cut blocks of blackish trap-follery. Nothing that Humboldt had seen of the remains of Roman roads in Italy, the south of France, or Spain was more imposing than these works of the ancient Peruvians. They originally found a line of communication through all the provinces of the empire, extending over a length of more than 1,000 miles. Proceeding from Asue towards Cuenca, the road led them to the ancient fortress of Canar. It was on a hill terminated by a platform and was in excellent preservation. A wall built of large blocks of freestone rose to the height of 20 feet, forming a regular oval, the great axis of which was nearly 120 feet in length. The interior of this oval was a flat piece of ground covered with rich vegetation. In the center of this enclosure stood the fortress of Canar, a house containing only 2 rooms, the walls of which were 20 feet high. It was probably a lodging place for the Incas, which they journeyed from Cuzco to the kingdom of Quito. The foundations of a great number of edifices surrounding the enclosure showed that they were was enough room to lodge the small army which accompanied the Incas on this journey. What was curious about the fortress of Canara was the form of its roof, which gave it appearance of a European horse. As one of the first historians of America, Pedro de Sequia de Leon, who began to describe his travels in 1541, says that several similar houses, which he examined in the province of Las Canaras, were covered with rushes. This house was probably added to the conquest of Peru by the Spaniards. Leaving the fortress of Canar, the travelers came by a valley hollowed out by the river of Gulan. Here they found near small footpaths cut into the rock. These paths led to a fissure, which the ancient Peruvians called the Ravine of the Sun. In this solitary spot, shaded by beautiful and luxuriant vegetation, the travelers saw an isolated mass of sandstone, 12 or 15 feet high. One side of this rock was remarkable for its whiteness. It was cut perpendicularly, as if it had been worked by the hands of man. On this smooth white ground was several concentric circles representing the image of the sun. They were blackish brown, and the space they enclosed were features half effaced that indicated two eyes and a mouth. Examining these circles closely, Humboldt found that they were small veins of iron ore, common in every formation of sandstone. These features indicating the eyes and mouth, which were evidently made by some metallic tool, were probably added by the Peruvian priests to impose upon the people. When the Spaniards conquered the country, it was to the interest of the missionaries to efface them, and it was accordingly done. Humboldt saw traces of their chisels in all the circles. The foot of the rock was cut into steps, which led to a seat, hollowed out on top, and so placed from the bottom of a hollow the image of the sun might be seen. The natives related that when the Inca Yupagangi advanced with his army to conquer the kingdom of Quito, then commanded by Cando of Lican, the priests who accompanied him, discovered on the stone the image of the divinity whose worship ought to be introduced among the conquered nations. The prince and his soldiers considered the discovery of the stone as a lucky augury, and it no doubt contributed to the choice of the ground on which the fortress of Canar was built. Nearby was a chain of hills which was one part of the garden belonging to the ancient fortress. Here, as to the path of the ravine, the travelers found a number of small pathways cut in the slope of the rock, which was scarcely covered with vegetable mold. There was not a tree which seemed to have outlived 50 years. Nothing reminded them of the Incas except a small monument of stone placed on the edge of a precipice. At a distance it resembled a sofa, the back of which was decorated with a small arabesque in the form of a chair. From the singular chair, in which but one person could sit at a time, there was a delightful prospect. Here, without the doubt, the Incas used to sit and gaze upon the surrounding country. Before them was the verdant valley through which ran the river Gulan, broken into cascades and forming along through tufts of Ganara and Molastomas. Behind and around were the everlasting hills. The travelers rested while at Loxa and visited its Chicoca woods, which yielded quinine or Peruvian bark. Peruvian bark was first brought into Europe at the middle of the 17th century. either as Sebastian Badus asserts to Alcalá de Henares in 1632 or to Madrid in 1640. On the arrival of the wife of the viceroy, the Countess of Chinon, who had been cured of the intermittent fever at Lima, accompanied by her physician, Juan del Viego, the trees which yielded the finest quality of quinine were found from 8 to 12 miles to the southeast of Loxa. In the mountains of Uritugu, Villanaqua, and Rumastana, they grew in dense woods and aspired above the surrounding trees. Their leaves were 5 inches long and 2 broad, and a peculiar reddish color. When they had upper branches waved to and fro in the wind, their glittering could be seen at a great distance. The quinine tree was cut down in its first flowering season, or in its 4th or 7th year of age, according as it had been sprung from a vigorous root shoot or from a seed. Humboldt learned that at this period of his journey, according to the official computations, only 11,000 pounds of the bark were collected annually. None of this precious store found its way into the commerce. The whole of was sent from the port of Patia on the Pacific round Cape Horn to Cadiz for the use of the Spanish court. In order to furnish this small quantity, 800 or 900 trees were cut down every year. The older and thicker stems were largely becoming scarce, but the luxuriance of vegetation was such that the younger trees, which supplied the demand, through only 6 inches in diameter, often attained the height of 50 or 60 feet. Between the Indian villages of Ayavaca and Guachabamba, the travelers found the ruins of the city of Chulucanas. These ruins were situated on a slope of the Cordilleras, near the brink of a river, from which they were separated by a wall. 2 openings in the wall corresponded with the 2 principal streets of the city. The houses built of porphyry were distributed into 8 quarters, formed by the streets cutting each other at right angles. In the center of these quarters, each of the were contained 12 small habitations, were remains of 4 large buildings of an oblong, separated by 4 square buildings occupying the 4 corners. The hill by which the city stood was divided in 6 terraces, the plantations of which were faced with hewn stone. On the right of the river, which bounded the city, they discovered an uncouth structure, evidently an ancient amphitheater. The region of a country in which they were now traveling, a series of mountainous wilderness, was cold and stormy. They were often for days in a dense mist, or worse still, they endured the peltings of violent showers of hail, which cut their faces and hands. The vegetation had peculiar character from the absence of the trees. The short, close branches of the small-leaved, myrtle-like shrubs, the large-sized and numerous blossoms, and the perpetual freshness of the full from the constant and abundant supply of moisture. At various points in their journeys, they came upon the remains of the old road of the Incas. The finest portions of these roads were at Chulucanas, and in the neighborhood of Intigatamapopo. At Pomahuaca, it was 9,700 feet lower at the latter place than an estuary. They found placed at nearly equal distances apart. Stations consisting of dwelling houses built of well-cut stone. These stations were a kind of cavasari, were called tambos, and Inca houses. They were surrounded by a kind of fortification. Others were constructed for baths with arrangement for conducting hot water. The largest of them were designated for the use of the family of the monarch himself. There were two great artificial Peruvian paved stones, or systems of roads covered with flat stones, or sometimes even the cemented gravel. One passed through the wide and arid plain between the Pacific Ocean and the chain of the Andes, and the other over the ridges of the Cordilleras. Milestones or regular markings of the distances were often found at regular intervals. The road was conducted across rivers and deep ravines by the bridges of stone, wood, and rope. Both systems of roads were directed at the central point of Cuzco, the seat of the government of the great empire. As the Peruvians employed no wheel carriages, and the roads were consequently only designed for the march of troops, for men carrying burdens, and for lightly laden llamas, Humboldt and Bonpland found them occasionally interrupted on account of the steepness of the mountains by long flights of steps. Provided with resting places at suitable intervals, Francisco Pizarro and Diego Almarago, who on their distant expeditions used the military roads of the Incas with so much advantage, found great difficulties for the Spanish cavalry at the places where these steps occurred. The impediment presented to their march on these occasions was so much greater because in these early times of the Conquista, the Spaniards used only horses, which instead of the carefully treading mule, who in difficult parts of the mountains seemed to only deliberate on every step he takes. It was not until a later period that mules were employed. Sarmiento, though, who saw the roads of the Incas while they were still in perfect state of preservation, asked a relication which long lay unread, buried in the library of Escorial, how a nation unacquainted with the use of iron could have completed such grand works in so high and rocky a region extending from Cuzco to Quito on the one hand and to the coast of Chile on the other. The Emperor Charles, he adds, with all his powers could not accomplish even a part of which the well-ordered government of the Incas effected through the obedient people over whom they ruled. Hernando Pizarro, the most educated and civilized of the three brothers, who for his misdeeds suffered a 20 years imprisonment at Medina del Campo, and died at last 100 years of age in the order of sanctity, exclaims, "In the whole of Christendom there are nowhere such fine roads as those which here we admire." The two important capitals and seats of government of the Incas, Cuzco and Quito, are 1,000 English geographical miles apart in a straight line, without reckoning the many windings of the way, and including the windings. The distance is estimated by Garcilaso de la Vega and other conquistadors at 500 leagues. Notwithstanding the great distance, we learn from the well-confirmed testimony at the Liceato Polo de Andalagardo that Juana Capac, whose father had conquered Quito, caused some of the buildings, materials for the houses of the Inca in the latter city to be brought from Cusco. When enterprising races inhabit a land where the form of the ground presents to them difficulties on a grand scale which they may counter and overcome, this contest with nature becomes a means of increasing their strength and power, as well as their courage. Under the despotic centralizing system of the Inca rule, security and rapidity of communication, especially in the government of troops, become an important necessity of government. Hence the construction of artificial roads on so grand a scale, and hence also the establishments of a highly improved postal system. Among natives in various different stages of cultivation, we see the national activity display itself with peculiar predilection in some particular directions. But we can by no means determine the general state of culture of a people from the striking development of such particular and partial activity. Egyptians, Greeks, Etruscans, and Romans, and Chinese, and Japanese, and Hindus show many interesting contrasts in these respects. It is difficult to pronounce what length of time may have been required for the execution of the Peruvian roads. The great works in the northern part of the empire of the Incas in the highlands of Quito must at all events have been completed in less than 30 or 35 years, i.e. within the short period intervening between the defeat of the ruler of the Quito and the death of Huayna Capac. But entire obscurity prevails as the period of the formation of the southern roads. Notwithstanding the tributes of admiration which the first conquistadors paid to the roads and aqueducts of the Peruvians, they not only neglected the repair and preservation of both these classes of useful works, but they even wantonly destroyed them, and this is more towards the sea coast than on the ridges of the Andes, or in the deep cleft valleys by which the mountain chain is intersected. In the journey from the rocks of Zualala to the valley of San Felipe, the travelers were obliged to wade through the Rio de Chabamba, which flowed from the Amazon no less than 27 times on account of the windings of the stream. While they continually saw near them, running in a straight line along the side of the steep precipice, the remains of the high-built road of the Incas. The mountain torrent, though only from 120 to 150 feet broad, was so strong and so rapid that in forwarding it, their mules were often in danger of being swept away by the flood. As their mules carried their manuscripts, their dried plants, and all that they had been collecting for a year past, we can conceive the suspense with which they were watched from the other side of the stream until a long train of 18 or 20 beasts of burden had passed in safety. The same river in the lower parts of its course, where it had many falls and rapids, was made to serve in a singular manner for the conveyance of correspondence with the coast of the Pacific, in order to expedite more quickly the letters of Truxillo, which were intended for the providence of Juan de Barcelamos, a swimming courier, as he was called in the country. Once employed, this post messenger, who was usually a young Indian, swam in 2 days from Huaca to Tumepende, first by the Rio de Chamaya, then by the Amazon. He carefully placed in the few letters entrusted to him in a large cotton handkerchief, which he wound round his head in the manner of a turban. When he came to the waterfall he left the river and made a circuit through the woods in order to lessen the fatigue of his swimming for so long a time. He sometimes threw one arm around a piece of very light wood. Sometimes a friend went with him to bear him company. The pair had no concern about improvisations, as they were always sure of a hospital reception in any of the scattered huts, which were abundantly surrounded with fruit trees.